afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to World Bee Day, UN World Bee Day with the Center for Global Education. Today is the 4th year of this wonderful new celebration of the importance of pollinators in our food security and sustainability and the way that we live and organize our worlds and our communities and agriculture and all that wonderful juicy stuff. My name is Sarah Flynn, and I am the program director here at the Center for Global Education. We have a great lineup of our agenda today with guests from British Columbia all the way to, well, so sort of coast to coasty in a way, that will be joining our schools from across Canada and some as well from the US. And we have a few friends joining us from Brazil online. I know they are going to be watching a little bit later today. They're about a half-hour delayed with their school schedule. But I wanted to first acknowledge that we're all joining from different places around Canada, and even the US and in Brazil. And through that, I want to acknowledge the lands on which we're joining from, whether they be treaty, non-treaty lands that we call our home. And then we acknowledge the peoples who lived on these lands before us, the roles that they played in agriculture, and the stories they have to tell about sustainability and environmental knowledge, and knowledge that we are trying to reclaim and understand and hear that knowledge again. And so through that, I want to acknowledge all the Indigenous peoples, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who live across Canada, and how we are learning to hear their stories again. World Bee Day, yay, welcome everyone. This year, the UN has said that the theme is Bee Engaged. There are just so many great bee puns when it comes. It's like one of those wonderful sort of words that allows us to really playfully have a day with it. So they are Bee Engaged, Build Back Better for Bees. And this is, the event calls for global collaboration and solidarity to the threats posed by both COVID to food security, but also to environmental changes, climate change, and how it's impacting the livelihoods of beekeepers, but also the environment and the ecosystems that exist for pollinators throughout our countries, whether it's Canada, US, Brazil, all the countries that might be joining us today online on YouTube. How are our bees and our pollinators in general surviving these changes and surviving, whether it be from COVID and the impacts that has on beekeepers and the sort of the agricultural food production lands, and how it impacts our environment as well. We want to raise awareness and support all of the pollinators that exist. And we're focusing on bees. It's a wonderful story in there today. We have our friends, we have two guest speakers joining us today from across Canada. We have Paul Westerndorf, who's the BC, who's apiculturalist, is I guess the old-fashioned word. There's a new condensed word that I continually mispronounce, but he is the bee guy. He says that we're welcome to call him that. And Paul has a wonderful history, both spanning from Holland, where he has this great, his bio online is short and doesn't sort of capture the amazing work that he's been able to accomplish. And he says that when he was a young boy in Holland, he visited a beekeeping farm with his school class, and the environment in which the smells, the visuals, all of that sort of really inspired him into beekeeping. And I think that's so wonderful to think of how something that impacted you so young and made such an impression on you when you were a young boy turned out to be your career. And you've been able to stay with this and really believe that inspired life. And it's so great to hear that transition and the amazing work you've got to do. And I know you have some great giant hornet stories, which were like the reason I was trying to internet stalk you, because that, I mean, I think that started off the COVID pandemic, didn't it? It was like, not only do we have a pandemic, but we have giant murder hornets. What does that even mean? So I'm excited to hear some of your stories. We also have Sage Handler joining us from Bees at Schools, and she's a master's student. And I think there's that wonderful dichotomy in the conversation today, where he was someone who's been seasoned in a career and has experienced a lot of different changes, both in terms of climate and the industry and food security over the years. And then we have a new new generation of scientists coming through and seeing how they can contribute to this evolving conversation. So thank you to Paul on stage for joining us today. Paul, I'd like to welcome you to start us off today with some knowledge building and sharing about your experiences. Over to you,
Wow.
Paul.
Thank you for this rather illustrious introduction. I'm not sure that it creates the wrong impression here. Yes, I started very early with bees and beekeeping, and by default, if you will, circumstance, I ended up spending my entire career with bees and beekeepers and everything else in different parts of the world, not just here in Canada, but also in East Africa. To start out with, this has all come about because of the Bee Hive Cluster that we have at the University of British Columbia, which was formed a couple of years ago with a number of people from very different disciplines and pursuits, and there was a certain common refrain throughout their different specialties and their research efforts. And it is really interesting that because of today's environment challenges that we face, many in the bee business and in both native pollinators as well as in the honeybee business, we are starting to become more and more concerned about how we can sustain these particular resources in a healthy and a productive fashion. And I was invited at the time to, a couple of years ago now, to make one of the first presentations at UBC on behalf of the Bee Hive Cluster. And I had a slightly more sobering kind of message in my presentation. This was a presentation that took over 3/4 an hour. It is not what I'm going to cover now, but it had to do with the fact that many researchers, and Sage will probably talk about this later, about the highly specialized forms of science and technology that is now directed to better bees and beekeeping and to solve some of the challenges that we face worldwide on bees. I had a slightly more sobering and a more broad issue to deal with, and that is basically our collective societal footprint on the environment and the impact that that has on honeybees, but also on the native pollinators. And if there is one message that I like to convey to everyone, is that we should and cannot and no longer afford to look things in its isolation. So here we have, for example, honeybees. Well, honeybees is a livestock form and highly specialized form of livestock that needs to be treated and handled carefully in order to sustain them. But there are today a great number of diseases and pests that make it very difficult for honeybees to survive. So if we just merely address each of those challenges individually, we often lose the larger picture of it. Honeybees, like all native pollinators, have to function in the environment from which they can derive food in the form of nectar and pollen and a variety of other products that they collect. And so we have to look at it from an environmental perspective rather than strictly from a singular bee perspective. And even beekeepers, by the way, are often very much focused on one particular thing. And that is, oh, let's try to make as much honey as possible, without really addressing what is actually out there in the environment that makes it possible for bees to be productive and to be sustainable. We have also seen greater developments in general, where agriculture, as well as our activities in the landscape, has caused terrible alterations in the landscape. While 30, 40, 50 years ago, greater swaths of the land in North America was still natural or undisturbed, in the meantime, we have gone into a process where more and more lands are being cultivated and altered. And then we have a societal attitude as well, by saying anything that has no monetary value in terms of plants or vegetation, we might as well just mow it or spray it with herbicides or pull it out or burn it or whatever we do. And often we don't recognize that these are often the dinner tables, if not the houses, the homes of all kinds of small wildlife, including many of the native pollinators. And by having this kind of singular, destructive, self-serving, and often opportunistic approach to handling the natural environment, we are driving collectively towards reduced biodiversity. And reduced biodiversity in many habitats is creating a great number of problems for the long term. Environments that have reduced biodiversity mostly end up having less or greater susceptibility to unforeseen developments in the form of floods or heats or droughts or fires or whatever they are. And that makes these habitats much more vulnerable. Not just that, reduced biodiversity also means there is in the long term reduced productivity. While some habitats used to have maybe a difference of something like 10 different species of pollinators, not just honeybees, but others as well, perhaps in many areas now we no longer have the 10, but we only have 2 of them. This makes the habitat very vulnerable for breakdown and for non-sustainability. So if people would ask me, well, what is the best thing that society can do? What can an individual do to support greater biodiversity? Very, very simple. Don't necessarily go into beekeeping because beekeeping requires serious commitment, management, and knowledge. But what you can do as a citizen, plant more plants, specifically plant more bee-friendly plants. So in your gardens, instead of having just some boring shrubbery that has minimal support or minimal maintenance, what about planting some wonderful flowers such as nepeta, catmint, lavenders, bee balm, all kinds of other floral sources that flower throughout the summer season and provide the dinner table for a whole plethora of different kinds of pollinators. That is probably the greatest contribution that individual people can make to this greater sustained environment in their local, in their neighborhood or in their environment. So I did it all in 17 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever.
Amazing. Now, I know that you have a lot of experience both here in Alberta and in BC. Do you see a difference in terms of the how, I don't know, like the culture around bees between the two provinces? Is there one, the way they're treated in terms of agriculture? I mean, Alberta is a very agriculture oriented resourcing, that's our natural resourcing. Is there more attention paid to bees here, or is there the opposite sort of effect?
Well, we have to separate it out between native pollinators and beekeeping, honeybees. If we can focus just on honeybees, and by the way, just out of interest, everybody should be aware that even though we have here in North America an estimated 3,500 different species of bees, most of which are solitary bees and are not managed by humans as such. So there are 3,500 species. Honeybees is just one species, and the genus Apis to which it belongs is not even represented in the Americas. So in other words, honeybees were introduced from the Asian European continent by European settlers way back 400 years ago. Okay, so honeybees are technically foreigners to this entire continent. So when we are dealing with beekeeping, honeybee keeping, the prairie provinces really are the bulk, the major producers of honey, and that is where beekeeping is on a very large scale. I mean, in some parts of the prairies, you have beekeepers that operate as many as 25,000 colonies. Here in British Columbia, because although we have a very large province, we can only operate bees productively in the valley bottoms, essentially, and as a result, actual suitable beekeeping areas is somewhat limited, and therefore the operations are much smaller. Here we have far more urban beekeepers and small-time hobby beekeepers versus Alberta. and the prairie provinces in general. Now, there are also significant climatic conditions, differences, and as a result, the methodologies that are used to manage colonies in the prairie provinces is very different from what it is out here. Because in the prairies, you have basically one or two major floral sources that produce all the nectar and that produces all the honey, while out here we have a dribbling of nectar and pollen sources starting from March all the way up to October. So it's a very different approach, and therefore it requires a very different management system.
So if Alberta's reliant on a few pollinators, is it more vulnerable then to like a crop loss? Like if their main sources of pollen, if there's a threat to that?
Well, nectar is what most beekeepers are after because that turns into honey. So pollen is basically the protein source that the bees need for feeding their babies, their bee brood, okay? But what I'm trying to say is that their management cycle for beekeepers out there is very much directed that even when the snow is still on the ground, they start to feed these bees a lot of protein in the form of pollen and pollen substitutes and pollen supplements to enlarge this nest to reach the maximum size. And the moment that the nectar flow is on, is what we would call it, that is when you need a maximum population of bees to be able to take it all in. And so we have in the prairies, particularly in Alberta, for example, in the Peace River and in northern Saskatchewan, productivity levels of something like that individual colonies can produce 200 to 300 and sometimes 400 pounds of honey per colony. We will never have that here in British Columbia because we have that small little dribble of nectar sources that become available over the entire season. It's a very different management system. Now, the 400 I'm saying is not common. I mean, but I do remember when I worked at the research station at Beaver Lodge in the early 80s, that we did research on the colony productivity. And I do remember vividly that I had to measure every bloody pound that came out of some of these colonies. And that's why the maximum that we ever reached was one colony that produced 427 pounds. And that was a lot of hard work. So.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, and by the way, I wanted to just add to it. You have mentioned and referred to it a couple of times about the Asian giant hornet. That is a totally different subject matter that needs a completely different day or presentation altogether. Too many details involved there. So let's not talk about that.
I can imagine when I think about it, and I was reading, oh, look at that thing. When I was reading about it online, I assume it was very like CSI, like a TV show where you were tracking it down, and because you had to go find the nests and everything. Like I can only imagine how cool it was in terms of field research and that aspect of it. Now I know that we have, I mean, Lacombe in itself is an amazing school that has a lot of beekeeping going on, and I'm sure their teacher, Mr. Schultz, is just bursting with questions for you. And so I don't want to take up all the time asking questions. I'd love to open up to all the schools in terms of, there is a request to see the bee again, because I guess I was speaking and so I was the one that was pinned on the YouTube, and so I'm going to let you introduce the bee and I'll pin you.
This is what you're referring to? But it's not a bee, this is a wasp.
The wasp, sorry.
This is the largest hornet in the world, which is called the Asian giant hornet. And as you can see, it is marked. I'm sorry that the picture is not perfect, but and this is a so much smaller one. I have here an artificial one, and if you can see the size of my head, this is the size. If I hold it right beside it, it is the largest hornet in the world, and it has a body length of close to 5 centimeters and a wingspan of about 7 centimeters. It's a very intimidating large insect. We are concerned about its arrival out here, but it is not similar. It is not nearly as worrisome as another Asian species that has been introduced in Europe called Vespa velutina, and that one has very different predatory behavior, which is far more damaging than this character. This character is a kind of a slow slow poke character that that only is after big, large insects as for prey. But let's not talk about Asian giant hornets.
Okay. It is fascinating, but you're right. All right, Stephen, I'm going to open up sending it over to you because I'm sure you have an amazing couple of questions that you want to get out. And then we have some people who have made comments in the chat, and we'll get to those as well as we'll see if anyone from YouTube has a question or two. But we'll open it up first with Stephen, then maybe perhaps someone from Mill Pond, or if there's any other students who'd like, you're welcome to raise your hand or just unmute after we throw to Lacombe. Over to you, Lacombe.
Yeah, it's amazing to be here and listen to your wide variety of experiences. I'm also going to challenge my class who's on a Google Meet to post questions in the chat that I can also ask our distinguished guests. But first question I think is, from we are planting lots of plant-friendly plants. We have 200 fruit trees, and we have 6 flower gardens that are trying to meet the needs of the bees. What would you say would be the most important lesson to teach students about beekeeping in general, or about landscaping for bees?
Well, landscaping, of course, is a human activity, and we can tailor make it according to what we feel is looking nice or is productive of whatever. But let's step back a little bit, and for all the students that are listening in, let's look at it from a strictly biological and an ecological sense. About more than that, about 90 million years ago, the world of vegetation was very dull. There were primarily these ferns and all kinds of other plants that were largely reproducing asexually. And it was only about 95 million years ago when the true flowering plants came into being. And this was really, from an ecological perspective, a revolution that took place. And what that meant was that plants started to develop sexual organs that were specifically designed, of course, for reproductive purposes. The problem with plants have always been that they cannot just get themselves out of the soil, walk over, have a little bit of fun, and walk back again. So their sex life is very restricted. Now, some plants have decided to use wind as a means of dispersal and help them to reproduce that way by releasing huge quantities of pollen grains that whiff all over the countryside. Most of these pollen grains are wasted and will never reach the target of a receptive female flower, so that then reproduction can take place or pollination can take place. Now, when you have the flowering plants that are using an external agent that is like an insect, that is when it becomes very targeted. So it happens to be that all of our fruits and not vegetables, but primarily our fruits and all the seeds that we need for our foods are predominantly insect pollination dependent. And what that means is biologically that essentially bees, not just honeybees, but all these pollinators are a key component in the process of the sex life of flowering plants. Okay, without the bees, if you take that out of the entire environment, we would face ecological collapse, because now suddenly many of the flowering plants can no longer reproduce. And the result of that economically is, of course, terrible, because much of our economics in agriculture are totally dependent on the presence of bees. And if I can just put that even in other simpler terms for everyone to remember, some of us really like hot rod cars, okay? souped up vehicles that have maybe 1,000 horsepower engine in there. But that engine will never produce this 1,000 horsepower if you remove the spark plugs. The spark plugs in itself have no power. They don't do anything, but then enables the engine to run. This is the way we should look at pollinators. Pollinators are basically the spark plugs. The spark plugs to agriculture, the spark plugs to a lot of habitats where they fulfill the function for the machinery of the environment to operate successfully and sustainably. Take these spark plugs out and you're going to have a big problem on your hands. I hope that this answers the question.
Amazing. Mr. Schultz, would you like to share a bit about the program that you have at your school around beekeeping? I think it's such a unique program and an amazing thing to share with some of our other students and teachers.
Yeah, just let me turn my mic on. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we have an environmental organization or program or club called Ecovision, and about 7 years ago now, or 7 years ago, students approached me and said they were quite concerned about the pollinators, and at that time there was a disorder going around called colony collapse with all the bees. So we started doing our research, as we require all our students to do for all their projects. And we discovered that honeybees are not native to Canada. And I challenged my students to do research into what the native bees were. And they discovered that most of Canada's bees are solitary bees. And so we actually started our project building a home for solitary bees. And we call it Gigantic Bee Hotel. Has a couple thousand homes for solitary bees by drilling into old wood logs, holes, and getting reeds and putting them together and putting landscaping bark around the base of the bee hotel. And we were quite shocked that you know, the bees actually took up residence, and we had a couple hundred solitary bees the first year. And then at the same time, we built 4 of our pollinator gardens, and we deliberately planted them so that they would be sustaining for the bees throughout the growing season. This year, we went and counted, and we have several, almost 1,000 solitary bees have nested in our solitary bee hotel, which is quite phenomenal. A couple years after that, we decided to get honeybees. We were worried that there would be fierce competition, but we have been pleasantly surprised that that has not occurred. There are plenty of flowers, pollen, and nectar for all of them. And the solitary bees have their trees and flowers that they like, and our honeybees have different flowers that they like, and there are some that they both like. We currently we got permission from our city to host the bees, and also got permission from our, after 2 years of consultation called with roundtable discussions. And currently we are offering a 16 credit high school credit course for high school students through the beekeeping program in conjunction with O's College and the Green Certificate program. So I think we're one of the first high schools in Canada, if I know in Alberta, to offer credits for beekeeping. And then we launched a program with our city to train and host workshops before our urban beekeeping residents can own their own bees. And so we have successfully licensed 10 people. We want people to know the real issues and how to really take care of the bees before they actually go and take bees on their own property. So we have 10, maybe 11 residents. We were aiming for 25 by now, but COVID-19 has reduced our capacity at training people. And so what's magical about that program is it's completely run by students, as well as our beekeeping class. We train students to take care of the bees, and then they take care of the bees for us.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Very good.
And you guys make some amazing honey. I just ducked out into my pantry, and as you can see, it's almost gone. But this was made by their high school students, and they designed the logos and packaged it up and sold it to me very convincingly one afternoon when I went down to the school and had a little tour, and it is delicious. My kids love it. So amazing.
I think you're soliciting for a refill. That's what you're doing, aren't you?
Do you like that? Maybe. All right. Thank you, Steve, for sharing that. I'm always just so inspired by the work that your students are doing and the leadership they're taking in terms of learning about this. And then how can I, how does this cross-sect into my math class? How does this cross-sect into marketing? How does this cross-sect into sociology? Like there's so many different ways that this topic is when we think of bees, we think of something so small, but it really is such a powerful way of looking at agriculture more generally. And I'm always inspired by the work that your students are doing. Now, before we move to our friend Sage from University of Guelph, I want to give another chance for anyone else from either Mill Pond or Mr. Stewart's class who's here online, or Ms. Cornell's class who's here online to ask any questions. I know that I see, let's see if there's I'm going to do an empty pause. It looks like Vispa has raised their hand. You're welcome to unmute.
Oh, I'm sorry. I accidentally raised my hand.
Oh, no worries. I was trying to peer pressure you into finding. Okay.
May I add something to it, to this, the presentation about what you mentioned about that the native pollinators versus the honeybees, there was plenty of food available. And I thought that comment was an important one. I'm often being asked the question about, well, all these honeybees, do they outcompete native pollinators? And in some cases they do, at certainly critical times in the early spring when there is perhaps a limited amount of pollen available. But in general, and studies have shown this, it is not just my opinion, but if you have a certain habitat, a certain area that is covered with a floral source, and if you have only one species in there, let's say like honeybees, then you have a certain successful rate of seed set or fruit set. Okay. If, however, the same number of pollinating insects are in that same environment, but they consist of more species, different species, as a collective, larger, diverse pollinator fauna, as what we could call it, the productivity level of the flowering crop is enhanced. In other words, biologically and productively, a greater diversity of pollinators in a certain setting is always better than having only one single pollinator in there. So they're very complementary to each other. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Sorry.
Yeah, that makes sense. Oh, thank you so much. All right, Ms. Hopkinson, would you like to ask a question?
I would like to ask a question. So I teach 6th grade in Massachusetts and in America. It's on the East Coast. But I'm a teacher, but also my husband is a beekeeper. And he just got his 10,000 bees this weekend with his queen bee marked, which enables me to buy more flowers. So I love his hobby because then I get to buy more, any flowers I want, as long as they're pollinator flowers. My question is, though, this spring, he harvested some honey from the hive, and it was what I would call set honey. It's a little bit thicker. And normally he's harvested a runny honey, like that you would squeeze out of a bottle. So he's British, my husband is British, so he was excited to get the set honey because it reminded him of the honey that he gets in England. And I'm wondering what happened in the hive? What was the difference between runny honey and set?
Yeah, it's very simple. The nature of honey is determined by the floral source. Okay, so and that is of course comprised of a variety of sugars that make up the bulk of the honey. And keep in mind that nectar is 80% water and 20% sugars. It's a very runny affair that the bees converted with enzymes and everything else into just about the opposite. Now it becomes a sugar substance with only up to a maximum of 20% water, and the rest of it are all sugars. That is why you have a very thick environment. So there is a variability in the amount of water that is in honey. So if you have very dry honey, if I can call it that, that may have only a water content of about 14%. And that is a very viscous affair. While honey that is freshly harvested, that the bees have just completed it, it could well be, sometimes even be unripe honey, where it is even exceeding the 20%. Okay, and that is a very runny affair. So that is basically based on water content. Then you have above that, of course, also different compositions of the sugar ratios. Some of the honey that I collected over 30 years ago in Eastern Africa with some of the trees that were growing out there, that honey is still in its total liquid form. I don't want to eat it anymore because it is dull and it doesn't taste very good anymore, although I could eat it, but it is non-crystallized. While if you have canola honey that comes from the canola fields, as a beekeeper, you cannot afford to keep that in your comb for too long, because if you wait for too long, after a few weeks, it may crystallize. And then you have a terrible time to get it out of your comb. So the nature of honey is determined not by the bees. The bees couldn't care it one way or the other. For them, it's a carbohydrate source. Okay? It is the floral source that determines the color, the quality, the flavors, and everything else of the kind of honey that you are dealing with. And it has nothing to do with whether it is Britain, because in Britain, of course, you have a lot of honey that is sold under the heather label, and heather honey tends to be rather thick honey, while some of these other sources of floral sources tend to be very runny and equally good. There is nothing about impurities involved here. This is strictly the floral source determines the physical characteristics of the honey.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, Ms. Hopkinson, you're going to have to send me some honey now. That is the price. All right. I know we have some questions here, and I want to make sure we get to them. So hold them in your brains or write them down in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to them. But I do want to transition over to Sage, who's joining us from the University of Guelph, and give her a chance to talk about the program that they have ongoing there and some of the work that she does. And I'd love to hear two more about, as she's sort of in this sweet spot, right? Where a lot of the students who are joining us today are in high school or junior high and thinking about the future. And here Sage is a student who's doing her master's, and she's just in that pre-career pinnacle stage, and can maybe provide some thoughts on how she got to where she was or is. Anyway, Sage, over to you.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction and for having me here today. My name is Sage, and I'm currently a master's student at the University of Guelph, but I'm going to back up a little bit first. I grew up on a really small farm in southern Ontario, and my dad was a beekeeper since I grew up. So I started out as a honeybee gal, helping, so to speak, but mostly just eating honey while my dad did all the hard stuff. And, you know, I love being outside. So it was a natural progression to go to university and study environmental science. But I didn't know past the broad category of environmental science what exactly it was that I was interested in until I was in the co-op stream. And for all of you grade 11s or wherever you are in your time, I highly recommend taking a co-op stream if it is offered at the university you want, because it is such a great experience to learn maybe what you do enjoy doing, but even more so what you don't enjoy doing, because I had one awesome co-op experience and two good co-op experiences that still just taught me that that is not what I want to do. And even so, sitting here, I don't know what I want to do with my life, so to speak. I just know that I enjoy what I'm studying right now. And so that one really awesome co-op job that I took on, I was in third year of university, so maybe 21 years old. And it was with a native bee researcher here at the University of Guelph named Dr. Nigel Rain. And Nigel, you know, took me on as an undergrad. And so I was basically doing whatever the other grad students needed me to do. And so that was going out in the field and sampling wild bees, because they had a project going where they just wanted to know what kinds of wild bees were there in Ontario. And so I did that for a summer, and I liked it so much that I kept on doing it for the whole next year while I was doing my studies. And then when it came time for my undergrad degree to finish, I realized I wasn't quite done with university yet. I wanted to continue and do a master's. So, you know, I looked around at a bunch of different schools, and there are tons of schools doing really cool bee research in both honeybees and native bees. And I decided ultimately to stay at the University of Guelph, continue working with Dr. Nigel Rain, and also start partnering with another professor here at the university. His name is Dr. Dirk Stanke, and he doesn't know anything about bees, but he knows a lot about DNA barcoding. And so I got to pair these really cool different aspects of science and these new technologies. And so I'd like to share a couple screens, actually. Let us see if the technology will be my friend. So hopefully you can see that. Somebody yell at me if you cannot.
That's great.
Okay, perfect. But the project that I'm working on for my master's is called the Bees at Schools program. And so this started in spring of 2019. And so we invited some schools to apply to host a nest box for the summer. And so nest boxes go by many names: bee hotel, solitary bee box. But we sent out 100 of these in our first year, and then 200 last year, and 200 again this year to schools Canada-wide. And we wanted to show schools how research is done. So we have this really cool community science program. And so these nests remain installed from May to the end of August, and then the teachers send them back to me here at the University of Guelph. And then I get to open them all up, and I'm going to use DNA barcoding to identify who's in there. So I love to show these pictures because, I mean, it blew my mind when I first started opening these up. But the picture on the top is a leaf cutting bee nest. And so these are solitary bees that will lay a single egg and then make this egg have its cozy little apartment out of leaves. And so if you get really lucky and you're super observant, you can see these little bees flying around with tiny pieces of leaves in their mandibles, in their teeth. It is so cool. And so the bottom picture here, you can see some bee use some flower petals to make their nest, like the most aesthetic apartment for their babies. And the other bottom picture shows some of the other types of substances that bees use. So this looks like a whole bunch of soil using nests, or some bees will grind up the leaves and make it into a pulp instead of using whole pieces of leaves. And so I had a lot of fun opening all these nests up and seeing the cool stuff. And I'm currently in the process of using DNA barcoding to identify them. And so DNA barcoding is, you know, I say it's a new scientific method, but it's been around for at least 2 decades now. And so instead of identifying a species based on what it looks like, this identifies it based on a really short segment of DNA that everybody in that type of animal would share. So for bees, we get to use the CO1 gene. Every bee has this piece of DNA, and we can read it using this process, and it's kind of like scanning a barcode at the grocery store. So this is really lucky for me because most of the bees that I collect are in larval form, so they just kind of look like white blobs, and I am not a taxonomic expert. So DNA barcoding makes it a lot easier to get these identities that I need. And so once we have all this information, we're hoping to answer a few questions. We want to find out where these bees are, first of all, because these bees are not very well studied, unfortunately. We also want to know what kinds of foods that they're eating. And we want to know what their landscape is changing about them. So we have nests set up on some school properties or a lot of teachers' home properties, thanks to COVID-19. And we're going to get some landscape data based on their coordinates. So we'll know, are the bees surrounded by lush meadows, or are they surrounded by concrete? And we want to see how that affects their lifestyle. Now, there's a lot of itty-bitty pieces of work that are being done on bee information, and you know, bee scientists are just trying to put it all together. And so without trying to be too repetitive, I do have a couple of slides on bee diversity and some cool stuff that I love to share just because pictures of bees are so cute too. And so my first slide is a challenge. I have a bunch of insects on this screen. I want you to take a look at them. Only half of them are bees. The rest of them are really good mimics. Now, all sorts of insects love to mimic bees and wasps because that makes predators think that they have stingers. So I hope you've had a chance to look at these guys because I'm going to do the big reveal now. These 4 insects are not bees. So number 1 is a yellow jacket, a wasp. You probably recognize that one. Number 4 is actually a moth, super cute and fluffy, trying to pretend it's a bumblebee. And number 6 and number 8 are both flies. Now, just because they're not bees doesn't mean they're not pollinators, but they're also good sneaky illusionists. That means that the rest of these 4 are all bees. Bees come in all shapes and sizes. Our native bees are incredibly diverse. So we've got cuckoo bees and sweat bees and bumblebees up here. And number 5 is our most charismatic bee friend, the honeybee. And so again, I don't want to be too repetitive, but here in Canada, at least, the diversity of bees is so incredible. You know, we have one species of honeybee, which is introduced. It's a livestock. We take care of it. And we do depend on honeybees for so much pollination. But we also have over 900 species of native bees in all sizes and colors and shapes and lifestyles. And so there are 2 main lifestyles that these bees will use. The first is below ground nesting. Again, I'd love to share these pictures. They're just so dang cute. These bees usually live solitarily, or maybe they'll live close to each other like neighbors, and they'll bury underground and make a nest like this. They'll have a bunch of little chambers and lay their eggs. The other type is above ground nesting, and these are the ones that I study. And so these ones will make their little rows using either leaves or soil or tree sap, and that's where they'll lay their eggs. And so we have to recognize how important all these bees are for pollination, but we also have tons of other animals that do pollination. You know, we've got birds and bats and all sorts of other insects, including mosquitoes, which are actually great pollinators. They're little fluffy bodies. Only female mosquitoes drink blood. The male mosquitoes have to survive off of pollen. They're vegetarians. And so we're super thankful for all these insects and animals because these foods that we love depend on pollination. You know, not all food needs pollination. Many plants, like our grains, use wind pollination. But the ones pictured here all require some kind of animal, and our plates would look pretty sad without them. And so that's why we have to talk about conservation and what we can all do to help our pollinators. And we need to help our pollinators because there's a bunch of things that are currently threatening them. And, you know, pesticides, global environmental change, non-native species when there aren't enough resources, diseases, and habitat fragmentation and change, which is one of the biggest ones. And so bees need 2 major things to survive. You know, they need flowers and they need places to live. But unfortunately, when our landscapes start looking like this or like this, it can become really hard for bees to find the things they need. And so we need to help them out sometimes. And the first big way we can do that is using and including more native flowers for our bees. And it sounds like many of the classes here already know this. They're doing incredible things for the bees in their area, planting native flowers, and also considering the phenology of when these flowers bloom. So phenology is super important because bees need things to eat all year round. So we want to make sure we're including spring blooming flowers and fall blooming flowers. And the other things bees need are places to live. We've got our cavity nesting bees that like to live in, you know, hollow stems or holes in your wall. And we can also talk about bee hotels with these bees. I mean, some people have super incredible bee hotels, and these can be a really fun way to observe the bees that we have in our area and also augment their territory. The biggest thing to consider if you are using a bee hotel is to make sure that it remains well kept, because bee hotels can sometimes become a bit of a trap for parasites, and so it needs to be cleaned with soap and water every year. Our ground nesting bees just need some nice soil to lay in, and so, you know, leaving a bit of bare ground in your pollinator garden is a great way to make sure that they have a place. And so then we've got to pull it all together. We have very small-bodied bees here in Canada, and they only fly 150 to 600 meters. So within that space, you've got to make sure that they've got everything they need. And so that is super quick times what I want to talk to you about today. Thanks so much for listening. And happy to answer any questions, of course.
So great. You touched on a question that actually came off YouTube about bee hotels. And so I want to, our friends on who are visiting on YouTube, we've popped the link to that Stephen shared here in his, or that Mr. Schultz shared here with a link to a picture of their bee hotel. And then Sage, you touched on as well. And another question that came directly for you, Sage, off YouTube is, how different is the DNA in the species of bees? Like, is it quite distinct, and is it easy to build those family trees, or is it, yeah, tell us about bee DNA.
That is a really great question. And many scientists before me have been working on the DNA barcoding technology. And so luckily at the point where I'm at, we have fragments of DNA for insects and all animals that are different enough that you can identify down to the single species based on this one small fragment. So it's great. I mean, even within a genus, you can tell who's who for all the bees. The big challenge comes though, in that you have to have something to compare to. So you might know that two things are different, but if nobody knows what those things are, then you can't figure out what they are. So we use databases called BOLD, the Barcode of Life database. And this is where tons and tons of scientists have put work into putting these specific gene fragments in so that we can then compare them. So as long as there's something to compare to, we can tell what species it is.
Amazing. And so is it, like, are Canada's populations distinct from, say, America, say Massachusetts? Would you be able to tell the difference between bees from the US and Canadian bees? Do they got little passports?
No passports, no. And we do have a lot of overlap in the bees that we have, especially here in Southern Canada and the bees in more Northern United States. So, for my study, I know where each bee comes from. So that's how they're getting their Canadian passport. But, it's all shareable DNA and shareable information in these databases.
Amazing. I guess, Sage, this question comes from Arushi, who's joining us from Mill Pond, and it kind of touches on both of you in that you have you lived on the farm and you're involved in beekeeping that way, and Paul, you work so closely in terms of the larger agriculture industry, and it'd be great to have both your perspectives on this. But what she was wondering, what will be the consequences of bee population decline? Both if we're seeing any of the consequences of those now, or with climate change, what will be the consequences of that in the future, do you think?
It depends on which bees you're talking about. It's somewhat interesting that since the media is often talking about the imminent decline in bees and bee populations. The irony of it is that here, at least in British Columbia, or in Canada, I cannot speak for the United States, but in Canada, there are currently more honeybee colonies under management than ever before. Over 750,000 bees colonies are being handled. So what's the difference compared to 30 or 40 years ago? The difference is that the productivity level and the service life of honeybee colonies is much shorter and is of much greater expense to operate than what it was 30 or 40 years ago. We have a much higher rate of turnover in our honeybee populations than ever before, and that is largely due to the points that Sage already raised, all the threats that the bees face from diseases to intense agricultural activities, pesticides, and the whole thing. Native pollinators have always gone through major population cycles, and therefore it is often more difficult to really quantify the overall trend that is taking place. So quantitatively, we are not having an acute concern, but our kind of uneasy concern is focused particularly on the decline in the diversity of the pollinator fauna. The fact that kind of unnoticed certain species seem to disappear from certain habitats. And again, what Sage mentioned, and I really appreciated her presentation here, habitat fragmentation is an awful thing. We have, we all love to have our big parking lots and highways and byways and I don't know what. These are all assaults on the entire longevity or the future prospects for many of these native pollinators. That is the serious threat. And therefore we have to do something instead. If I may just take the advantage of it, here in British Columbia, and I'm here the last one to start criticizing the forest industry. But what is happening is that in northern British Columbia, the native vegetative cover was largely poplar. And poplar is a deciduous tree that allows for a certain undergrowth that is rich in all kinds of other plants and insects. So after this is mowed down and all the wood is turned into toothpicks and in chopsticks, what then? Well, the forest industry puts in evergreen forests. But evergreens don't tolerate or permit the kind of diverse undergrowth that we had in the past. So this has a huge impact on pollinators and all kinds of other insects as well. This is the concern that we have as a society. We seem to alter and redesign many of our landscapes with very dire consequences. Sorry about being so negative, but it is worth that we are becoming aware of these things. That's the emphasis. And by the way, I should also mention for those of you who are all listening, Sage is very modest, but in fact, the University of Guelph, this is the bee center, the research center in Canada in terms of education in apiculture. That should be mentioned.
Thanks. Sage, did you have anything to add, or would you like to tackle our next question?
I think that Paul pretty much covered it. I mean, absolutely. It's not so much that we're seeing an overall decline in our bees, but that we're noticing that bees that were very diverse and present 20 years ago are no longer being caught. And unfortunately, the fact that we haven't studied them very well 50 years ago makes it very hard to tell what exactly is happening. And so that's why so many bee research labs are occurring now and trying to get to the bottom of that.
Well, I know that it is the hour has arrived, and so some of our schools do have to transition off to another, but I would love one last question, because I think it's Ijaz from Mill Pond asked a great question in the chat. I was wondering if they would like to unmute and ask it themselves. Are you still here? I know you guys have to leave right away.
Hi there. I believe that's myself.
Yeah.
I'm from Queen Elizabeth High School in Edmonton, Alberta.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were from Mill Pond.
No worries. And my name is Ijaz. And this question came right out of the blue, just for me. And I was wondering about beekeeping. So I was wondering what any biological and environmental implications were between the global north and the global south, because I do know that organisms and the way they function obviously will have a few differences based on their regions. And I was wondering if beekeeping, the way it's done, if there is even like, how do I say this, a standard way, if it's exclusively a global north practice.
If I may answer that question, if I take the liberty to do that, it's of course, first of all, most of the land masses in the world are on the northern hemisphere rather than the southern hemisphere. But there is extensive beekeeping activity going on in Argentina, and that is really functioning in the very same format and system as what we would have here in North America. Look at Australia, where of course Apis mellifera has been introduced as well as the honeybee, and the practices out there are very comparable again to what we have out here. The country of Chile has similar practices in modern agriculture as well, in addition to traditional beekeeping that involves of course non-Apis pollinators. The habitats out there are quite different, particularly in Australia, and there is a plethora of all kinds of native pollinators, some of which are birds. The honey creepers in Australia and Oceania are playing a major role, at least in the environment. But from a beekeeping perspective, the practices of modern beekeeping are basically the same as what they are in North America and in Europe and in Asia. I hope that answered the question.
So much.
Thanks. So Paul, if it's basically the same, where in the world, and Sage too, does your favorite flavor of honey come from?
British Columbia. What are you talking about? Of course. No, I it's again, it is floral based. So it depends entirely on what you like. A lot of North Americans like very light colored honeys that have very floral and very light scented flavors. Europeans tend to favor slightly darker honeys that are slightly more robust in the flavonoids that they have. So it is also a cultural practice and preference that they have. So it depends. On the other hand,
Like
if you eat buckwheat honey, that is almost as black as you can have it, and it has a very rich aroma and it's very different again. So it's personal preference.
Sage, how about yourself?
A quick thank you. And the Mill Pond students need to go because we have another class to get to. But thank you, thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Sage, what do you think?
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. It was
You're welcome.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to sign off. Well, but I'm still gonna wait until everyone's gone, then ask Sage what her favorite honey is, because I'm making a list. I'm gonna start buying the flavors. Thank you though so much to Paul and Sage for joining us today on World Bee Day to celebrate these amazing pollinators and such an important part of agriculture in Canada and science in Canada. It's exciting to see that I myself with a background in genetics, it's exciting to see that it's in bees too. Like there's so much going on that we just don't think we don't know about yet. And it's great to learn about all these different areas. And so thank you for sharing your time today. Really appreciate you coming and joining us. Thanks.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Okay. We're off YouTube. Sage, what's your favorite honey?